Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions, I believe, are relatively straightforward. I want to thank the Minister for his explanation so far on some of the critical areas that we've been discussing. The first question I have is perhaps the simplest. Now, Minister, this ministry is responsible for a large part of the markets. And our approach to markets, the way that the ones that currently exist and the way that we structure them, it's in quite a long-term arrangement. So there are tenants, and people are able to access these stalls or kiosks or facilities in order to vend certain products. I think there is another model that perhaps of a market that perhaps serves a different kind of vendor or kind of entrepreneur. And that is the entrepreneur who perhaps has more occasional produce. We have across Barbados farmers markets in particular locations. There's one on the West Coast, there's one in the center of the country. There are perhaps one or two that have a particular character. They are set up, I think, as yes, to allow people to get produce and to have a bit of an entertainment experience, to go out with their families on the weekend. And they have a certain tenor, these farmers markets. But a farmers market experience must also be available and accessible to any and all Barbadians. The farmers market experience that attracts perhaps more subsistence farmers, people that are not necessarily farming as their main occupation, but from time to time have produce and goods that they want to sell. But equally, as an economic marketplace for those individuals, but also as an experience for all Barbadians. And Minister, I think that you get my meaning when I say all Barbadians. A space that people can go and feel nice. That everybody can have a farmer's market kind of experience in a place and in an environment that is accessible and, quite simply, Minister, feels nice. Some of the places that you would want me to go, Minister, on a weekend to do my shopping, I feel harassed. And while we enjoy the typical market experience that I grew up with, and still, when I go to get my fish and go to get my produce, I still go to Cheapside and so on. That is set up for the kind of vendor that is going to go there every day and that always has fish to sell, that always has produce to sell. The vendor that is looking to make some money. Sometimes I spoke in this honorable place a couple of days ago about when my mother was trying to send us overseas and might kill some chickens and might find a way to occasionally sell the produce that she occasionally has. So on the one hand, setting up entrepreneurs who have a space to vend that is more accessible so that they don't have that kind of single license or tenancy agreement with your ministry, but then also setting up something that is enjoyable for all people and accessible for all people outside of that typical farmers market situation that we all know of. Are there any plans for that? What is the scope for that? What do you consider the value of that? That's my question.
Thank you, Honourable Member, and thanks for the question. Actually, you are just where my mind is at, and this is where I started in 2018, actually. So one may wonder, how come you started there and you're still not there yet? And there are a number of issues. One, it was a siloed approach to having these farmers markets set up right across Barbados. And I wanted to have them set up from independence right through to the week before Christmas, right across all 30 constituencies. There was a lot of effort that went into getting them done, but then the information that came back to me was that it wasn't going to be feasible because many of the farmers felt that they had other markets to attend to on weekends, and they didn't want to lose out on that opportunity. But equally, they wanted government to fund the whole exercise. And we came back to revisit it in 2019, and coming off that, whilst we were hoping to get it going, again, we had the same challenges. We were down in 2020 and 2021. 2022, we went into an election. I'm saying all this to you to say to you that I am keen on having farmers markets set up across Barbados. I have tried a few of them at the parochial level in St. Philip, and they have worked very well. Once we can get the sponsorship, once we can get the support to have these markets set up, we are definitely going in that direction. I have before me right now a request at BADMC to have a farmers market set up, which is constituted exactly the way you've just mentioned. That is not just a farmers market, but is a whole experience for a day. And when we roll out that would then give us the impetus for setting up others right across. But I completely agree that you cannot have the same experience by way of only public markets or vending zones, but that we can do temporary farmers markets to give people a completely different experience. The one that I have before me includes an entertainment package, so that is a completely different experience. And it sort of mirrors what we did for AgriFest, except that is not an expo, but just strictly a farmer's market. So yes, I agree, and it is not in our estimates at this point in time, but the Prime Minister did say to us that you can start here and come back later. So once we can create the correct model, we can actually set aside some kind of budgeting later on to establish the farmers markets across Barbados. I don't want to see a one-off thing. I want to see frequency, because we have a lot of farmers markets that happen right now. Brighton, for example, is about the best example. But I don't want to see just one farmers market. I want to see many. And therefore, I agree with you that this is something we should prioritize, and you can rest assured that coming off the estimates in the budget, it is something I'm going to look at for when we go back to the Prime Minister for further financing.
Thanks, Minister. Just as a follow-up suggestion, it may not be feasible to have 30 markets across 30 constituencies or even 11 markets across 11 parishes, but what you may want to consider is a north, central, south approach, or even a rolling marketplace where you're moving in between venues monthly, or just some tweaks to consider, given that you also be looking for the appropriate space. And we know that in Barbados, availability of suitable space for these things can be a challenge. Move on to I thank you for considering the suggestion, and move on to my second question. Minister, the Agricultural Development Fund has been, which is managed quote unquote, by the Enterprise Growth Fund Limited, has always been presented as that fund or that opportunity for agricultural entrepreneurs. It is meant to be sitting as it does with the Enterprise Growth Fund Limited, which is meant to generate revenue, which is meant to make these investments profitable. It is in fact meant to fund viable agricultural projects or companies. Now, the history of the fund over some time has not been one that has reflected that target or that goal. In my former dispensation, working with the Enterprise Growth Fund Limited, it was a concern because the Agricultural Development Fund, I dare say, is not set up to be only a social investment fund, even as social investments are needed. It is set up to provide resources to real viable agricultural products or companies, products or companies or services that are going to help generate some job-led, inclusive growth in this country or even arguably in this region. Now, I would like to hear from you, Minister, about what is the intention for the ADF with respect to, particularly with respect to, or need for it to support profitable enterprises. I have always been of the view that perhaps you may have to ring-fence some part of the fund for a development portion, to say some percentage will be that we take a chance on this project because we believe that it has national purpose or value, but overall, the ADF is meant to be profitable and generate a return. So I wanted to hear your position on that and what are the future plans for the fund?
Thanks, Honorable Member. You may recall that when you were the Minister in charge, we did discuss how we would approach the ADF. And we had looked, I think, there were 4 pillars that we could have used in order for us to utilize the fund. Since then, nothing much has happened. But what I say to you is that based on the feedback that has been coming into the ministry, there are 2 things that I'm addressing. One, you are right, how do we carve out a space for developmental projects that are of national interest? And then 2, how do we treat the fund as a viable commercial fund where it can be profitable? And the one thing that really stood out in the conversations we've been having is the rate of interest. The question is, if you want to make it a viable commercial fund, do you have a special interest rate that is separate and apart from what is currently the commercial bank's rate, and treat the ADF as a fund that has a special interest rate based on the demands on the fund and based on what farmers want to deliver? And then 2, how do you look at how the fund can be used to provide a couple of things, grant funding in the case of a natural disaster, and then funding for special projects where perhaps there may be some SPVs until the projects are settled. We have not yet settled these conversations, but we are working on them. A number of requests came to me for renewable energy, where there are existing large-scale farmers who want to add renewable energy to their mix. And we are still in conversations with them as to how, one, we would treat this as far as their responsibility to make sure that they're not moving away from our traditional agriculture, but using renewable energy as a means to profit, whilst creating challenges for us with traditional agriculture or contemporary agriculture using technology. So at this point, your questions are very good and very pointed, but we do not have, at this point in time, a settled position on where we are with the Agriculture Development Fund. And I can assure you that as the year goes by, especially when we get into the new financial year and we can get back to the recapitalization of the fund, that many of these changes will come to Cabinet for us to be able to address the future use of the Agriculture Development Fund. I trust I have addressed your question.
Thank you. I look forward.
And just to add to that, honorable member, we have a major issue where the costs to the ADF is just over $500,000 annually for the EGFL to manage the fund. And that is something we are also revisiting, because I believe that that's a substantial sum that can be used to do projects in agriculture.
Thank you, Minister. I'm hesitating because I'm trying to choose from the menu here. I'll settle on one final question. I'll settle on the one that stands at the nexus between your ministry, the ministry that you have some stewardship of, Minister, and the one of which I currently have some stewardship. Minister, as you know, I'm not one that is too quick or free with congratulations, but I will say that the work that you've done on plant protection and on some of the food safety and standards issues really has put the country in a good position with respect to the potential for export growth. And I really encourage you and us to continue in that regard. Similarly, the Barbados National Standards Institute, which is a part of the Ministry of Industry, Innovation, Science and Technology, has also been doing quite a bit of work in partnership with you to look at these issues of food safety and quality. And the orientation has mainly been with a view to export and to improve our exports. But as you and I have discussed from time to time, Minister, I have always seen a greater role to be played between the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Nutrition Security, and the food and nutrition security is the part that I'm getting to, between that area and the question of standards of the things that we consume locally, the things that our people either grow and consume locally or import for our consumption in terms of food safety and quality and nutrition quality. And there are, in other jurisdictions, agencies that have this responsibility to be able to say to us, I'll use an example. We take a lot of intelligence from other jurisdictions about the things that we should eat during the life cycle of a person in Barbados and the region. So, for example, we will say to women who are pregnant, you should perhaps not consume certain kinds of foods. You should not consume fish that is high in mercury. And we very loosely decide which fish those are, but we're not really talking about the fish that we fish in our waters. We are using as the benchmark the international standards, or probably more likely the US Food and Drug Administration guidance on, well, which fish, swordfish, tuna, because they are looking at the international markets for these fish. Where are they coming from? the waters in which there are mostly fish from, what is the heavy metal content there, and that's where a lot of the guidance comes from. But, you know, we are finding in our populations, in our majority populations in Barbados and this region, that there's certain pathologies, human disease, and so on, that are manifesting that we don't understand. And I'm concerned that we are not making the connection. Yes, we are testing and we're establishing standards for the food that we feed other people with, and we are very concerned that that food is healthy and meets these particular standards. But what about the food that we eat? And both with respect to imports and with respect to what we grow and so on for ourselves and what we harvest and gather for ourselves, at what point are we going to establish an authority that sets our own guidance and benchmarks for what we eat? Is there any plan? Is there any intention? And I concede that that must be in partnership with the BNSI. But is there any intention from your perspective, Minister, to make that a priority of what you deliver to the people of Barbados through your ministry?
I remember that is one of the good questions I've had for the day. Truthfully, this exercise has been quite encouraging. I'm indeed pleased with the response I've received from my colleagues today. And the questions, the very pointed questions in terms of keeping the public aware of what A, the ministry is doing, and B, what is possible, so that we can address what we're currently doing, but also keep the country appraised of the pathway to the future. We took a paper to Cabinet, I believe, in 2020, 2021, where we looked at the whole issue of standards, food safety, establishing a single unit that would be totally independent from the ministries. That is Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Health. And the reason why we did that, because we thought that between ministries, it became too territorial to achieve the results we want at the pace that we wanted it at. And that to establish a single unit would have been the preferred way. We did look at the Canadian model, and that is the model that we thought would have worked for us. We then had FAO assist us with a consultant to work out how it will work and how we would address the standards in terms of food safety, which would address all of what you mentioned in terms of food that we import, food from jurisdictions that we would have to look at carefully. This is something that the Chief Agriculture Officer is extremely passionate about. Equally, the Chief Veterinary Officer is also passionate about it. And I think these two gentlemen are in a good position to address what you've raised in terms of food safety, which is legislation we are currently working on, trying very hard to get that legislation anchored between us and the Ministry of Health. And the whole issue of harmonization between ministries sometimes can be a very difficult exercise, and that's the hardcore reality that we face. So that the establishment of a single unit, which is allowed to function independently, but is able to give us the deliverables that we need, is where I think we need to go. Honorable Member, what I would do is ask the Chief Agriculture Officer, Mr. Michael James, to speak to this matter, and then after him, Dr. Mark Trotman, so you get a sense of understanding of where we have been with this matter. It has been a long journey, and one that we hope to settle very soon, because when we submitted the cabinet paper, we were talking about $100 million, I think it was. That price obviously is going to be a lot more now. And what we wanted to do is to establish that unit with the assistance of the FAO and the consultant that was on board with us, and to use the Canadian model so that we would have a unit that can deal with food safety and standards. And yes, it did include your ministry as it stands right now.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Minister Caddle, for the question. The umbrella agency we were speaking about is National Agricultural Food and Health Food Control Agency, NAFCA. That was the acronym at that point in time. And as the minister said, we were working on this for nearly 15 years. So it's been a long time coming. At the international level, through the same sanitary and phytosanitary program or issues or methodologies, there are 3 bodies that have been given carte blanche to look at issues relating to these things. So you have the IPPC, International Plant Protection Convention, which looks at plant health. You have the World Organization for Animal Health, WA, which looks at the animal health. And you have Codex Alimentarius, which looks at the whole issue of food safety. In this case, in Barbados, that nexus with respect to food safety is the part that has been missing. We have been able to look at animal health and plant health, and Mark will speak to the animal health issue. But when it comes to food safety, there always seemed to be this, must be delicate in this sort of way, but persons tend to think that you're fighting for turf. And no matter what was projected or what was put forward, there was always this, you know, we're not ready or something else should happen. What NAFCA seek to do, and is still on the table, is that even if you don't have an agency, you have a system that would help persons that if in case, as you were saying, that things come from overseas, there's a testing methodology. There are times when you have to test, no matter what it comes, where it comes from. We usually think that because something comes from overseas, it's better than what's produced here. And that, in most instances, can be a fallacy. So it would have to, or we were seeking to develop a system, and Brett Taylor was also involved in this, where we had traceability, similar to what exists now under the FSMA Act in the United States of America. And we had persons trained just last week in the whole area of traceability, how you will make sure that farmers or whoever's doing things to their food stuff, that they go through taking records, making sure that you know what chemical you're using when you put on water, how safe is the water being tested. All of these things are in documents, they're there. It takes the will now to actually go forward and decide, are we gonna have a single unit, as was decided, or are we gonna have a system? Whatever we do, the Barbadian public should be the beneficiaries. You need to be able to say to persons, if you're drinking water, if you're eating food, this has gone through some sort of testing model, and this is what we're doing. Right now, it is fragmented. Sometimes you don't have the cooperation between the units. We depend a lot on personal agreements. So I know Mark, so I know what Mark is doing. Mark may know somebody in the Ministry of Health, they know what he's doing, but there's not that cohesion that is needed. And that is what NAFCA sought to do. The thing about NAFCA is that it was always plaguing the minister, and PS know this, with having persons to actually push this. We depended on primarily one person, and that is Dr. Beverly Wood. And that's a single point of failure. When Beverly isn't there, what happens? So you needed to have persons to be with Beverly so that they know what happens when she's no longer there, if she's retired or whatever. And we didn't have that. So right now, we are in this sort of, how should we say, stopgap measure, where we have developed the legislation, and the legislation is there to be looked at and reviewed by other agencies, but it's just stuck there. So we need to have, from all the players, to be on that same mindset to say, listen, you know, leave the ego at the door and let us concentrate on what we are doing, because it's supposed to benefit all Barbados. And I think it will stop there and let Mark take over from here.
Thank you very much. Not a lot more I can add to that. I think CAO has pretty much laid out what we've been trying to do. In a nutshell, what we have been trying to do is to make sure that we can monitor the entire food chain from start to finish, including inputs, additives, and everything that goes into the final product that people eat. And to make sure that across the entire food chain, there is some sort of regulatory oversight to make sure that there is no adulteration, there is no infection, there is no contamination, that the inputs, whether it be animals, whether it be plants, whether it be seeds, whether it be chemicals, that they all at that point are safe to consume, and that the process is safe to consume. So that was the idea that we were trying to put, as the CEO mentioned. The real challenge is that there has been perception over somebody taking somebody else's responsibility, turf over certain issues and so on. And that has never been the intention at all. I think we're making progress. We had Mr. Paul Mayers, who is a Barbadian, retired official with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who has graciously donated his time with the FAO's support to assist us in, because he was instrumental in establishing the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, worked many years as a senior officer in that agency. And so he's a wealth of knowledge, and he's been helping us come together with that. So we think we've made a lot of progress. We've managed to bring people on board who understand what we're trying to achieve. We're about to engage in a program again sponsored by the FAO, a food safety management system, or food safety management tool, an evaluation tool which allows us to see exactly where we are at and what we need to do to put these things in place. It's a fairly ambitious goal that we have, but I do believe that once we get enough commitment at all levels and get enough systems in place to make sure that Mike referred to the challenge with people coming and going and getting inconsistency. That it's been a sine curve with us trying to get this thing going, because you think you have everything together, but because it was always based on individual relationships, when someone retires or leaves or so on, we have to start all over again. So, there was a calypso a long time ago, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. We experienced that ourselves with this project. I'm very optimistic that we are on the right foot going forward with it, and that you'll probably see something more concrete coming out of it over the next year, where we actually have something, whether we end up with a full discrete agency, independent agency, staffed and operational, or whether we have a series of MOUs or concordats or agreements between ministries to operate within their respective structures. I think we still need to address that issue and have a positive way forward on that. But with the new way we're moving forward on it, I'm very optimistic that we will get something concrete very soon. It also speaks into the Honorable Minister for St. James South has been talking about SPS issues constantly. I know I've engaged her very often on that matter. And this is really what we're talking about. If you want to go down that road, this is really what we're talking about, being able to have this system to satisfy our SPS obligations, so we can not only make sure that there is food that is safe for the Barbadian consumer, but also can be exported anywhere in the world once we meet that standard. Thank you.
Minister and colleagues, I really have to thank you for the frankness of these responses. My sister, who's no longer with us, used to say, if you don't left home, you don't find out anything. And I feel like this has been a real education in where you are in this process. I'll close by saying, apart from saying thank you, I'll close by saying that if there's one thing that it's now 8 years in political service has taught me, it is that there is, in these matters, no room for ego and no room for jostling for turf. Because in the meantime, the people whom we serve, are not receiving the full benefit of that service from us. And so I am satisfied that if that is the only matter, the only or the primary issue, that we can certainly put that to bed. I would like to believe. But I will also say that your challenge with people retiring out of the work and leaving gaps is also a challenge that systems will solve. If we set up the correct systems, the correct standard operating procedures, the correct process and methodology for what we're doing, as both the gentlemen who spoke after you, Minister, know and practice, if we're able to do that, then we have a way forward. I will tell you that I am not a fan of MOUs between agencies of the same government to do a single task. I feel that we set up a multi-agency system and structure it properly with particular roles for each actor, then we have a way forward. I am pledging to you, Minister, in this honorable chamber, that certainly in my capacity as Minister currently responsible for industry, that you have our partnership through BNSI in these matters. And I don't hope, because hope is not a strategy, but I know that we will come to execution on this matter. I thank you.